The escape pod was running out of air. Jake Collins knew this because the warning light had been blinking red for 6 hours now. He sat in the darkness of the tiny metal box, floating through the endless black of space, and wondered if this was how he would die. 3 days ago, everything had been normal. He had been a sergeant aboard the research vessel Horizon's Edge, doing his job, protecting scientists who studied distant planets. Then the engine failed. Then the fire started. Then everything fell apart. Jake was the only one who made it to an escape pod. He tried not to think about the others. He tried not to think about anything at all. The oxygen meter showed 4 hours remaining. Maybe 5 if he breathed slowly. He closed his eyes and let himself drift. There was nothing else to do. Then the pod shook. Hard. Jake opened his eyes and saw light flooding through the small window. A ship had found him. A very large ship. He pressed his face against the glass and felt his stomach drop. The vessel was Volanti. He could tell by its design. Long, graceful, silver like a blade. Beautiful in the way that dangerous things are often beautiful. The Volanti were one of the oldest species in the galaxy. They had been traveling between stars when humans were still living in caves. They built great cities on 100 worlds. They created art and music that other species studied for generations. And they did not like humans. To the Volanti, humanity was young and foolish. Humans were loud. Humans were violent. Humans spread across the galaxy too fast, taking planets and resources without thinking about tomorrow. The Volanti tolerated humans the way a grandparent might tolerate a noisy child, with patience and quiet disapproval. Jake watched as the Volanti ship pulled his pod into its belly. He had no choice in the matter. His pod had no weapons, no engines, and almost no air. He would either accept their help or die. So he sat still and waited. When the pod doors opened, Jake found himself looking at 4 Volanti soldiers. They were tall, nearly 7 feet each, with silver skin that seemed to glow from within. Their eyes were gold, bright and unblinking like coins catching light. They wore armor that looked like flowing water frozen in place. None of them spoke. They simply gestured for Jake to follow. He walked through corridors that seemed carved from crystal. Everything was clean and perfect. The walls curved in ways that pleased the eye. Soft light came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Jake felt dirty and small, like a stray dog tracking mud through a palace. They brought him to a medical bay. Volanti doctors examined him without warmth. They treated the cuts on his hands and the bruise on his head. They gave him water and a small amount of food that tasted like nothing he recognized. Then they left him alone in a room with a locked door. Jake sat on a bed that was too long for his body and stared at the ceiling. He did not know what would happen next. He did not know if he was a guest or a prisoner. In his experience, there was often little difference between the two. Hours passed. Then the door opened again. 2 new Volanti entered. Jake could tell immediately that they were different from the soldiers and doctors. Their clothing was finer. Their movements were slower, more deliberate. They carried themselves like people who had never been afraid of anything in their lives. One was older, a female with silver hair pulled back from her face in elaborate patterns. Her eyes held the weight of years and power. The other was younger, also female, with softer features and a curious expression that she tried to hide behind a mask of dignity. Jake stood up. He did not know the proper way to greet Volanti royalty, but he guessed these 2 were important. Very important. The older one spoke. Her voice was like music, but cold music, the kind that made you shiver. "I am Saralyn," she said, "Queen of the Volanti Empire. This is my daughter, Princess Aleth. You are aboard my personal flagship." Jake swallowed hard. He had been rescued by the Queen herself. The odds of that happening were so small that he could not even calculate them. "Thank you for saving me," he said. I would have died out there. The Queen studied him like one might study an insect that had crawled onto the dinner table. Not with hatred, but with a kind of distant distaste. We detected your distress signal, she said. Valanthi law requires us to render aid to those in danger, even those whose species we find disagreeable. You will remain here until we reach the next human outpost. Then you will leave, and we will forget this encounter ever happened. Jake nodded. He understood completely. He was being tolerated, nothing more. I understand, he said. I will stay out of your way. The Queen turned to leave. But the princess lingered for a moment. Her gold eyes met Jake's, and he saw something there that surprised him. Not disgust or superiority. Something closer to curiosity. Maybe even interest. Then she followed her mother out, and Jake was alone again. Over the next 2 days, Jake learned the shape of his cage. He was allowed to walk certain corridors and eat in a small room on the lower deck. Servants brought him food and clean clothing. No one spoke to him unless necessary. He watched the Valanthi go about their lives. He saw how they moved with grace, how they spoke in soft voices, how they treated each other with formal respect. He also saw how they looked at him, some with disgust, some with fear, most with nothing at all, as if he did not exist. Jake did not blame them. Humans had a reputation in the galaxy. They were known for their wars, their aggression, their stubborn refusal to accept their place in the order of things. Jake had spent his whole life trying to prove that humans could be more than their worst impulses. But one man could not change how an entire galaxy thought. On the third night, Jake sat alone in the lower deck, eating a meal he could not name. The ship was quiet. Most of the crew had retired to their quarters. He thought about home, about Earth, about the family he had not seen in years. He did not know that in a few hours, everything would change. He did not know that blood would be spilled, lives would be lost, and he would make a choice that would bind him to this ship and these people forever. He simply sat in the silence, a stranger in a strange place, and waited for morning to come. The attack began with silence. Jake was eating his evening meal alone, as he always did. The food was some kind of grain mixed with vegetables he did not recognize. It tasted fine. He had stopped caring about taste days ago. He just wanted to reach the human outpost and get off this ship. Then the lights flickered. Jake looked up. The Valanthi ship was perfect in every way. Systems did not flicker. Lights did not fail. Something was wrong. He heard shouting in the distance. Then, screaming. Then the sharp sound of energy weapons firing. Jake moved without thinking. He pushed away from his table and ran toward the noise. Every part of his training told him to find cover, to hide, to wait for the danger to pass. But another part of him, the part that had made him a soldier in the first place, pushed him forward. The corridors were chaos. Valanthi crew members ran past him, their faces twisted with fear. Some were bleeding. Some were carrying wounded friends. None of them stopped to explain what was happening. Jake grabbed a young crew member by the arm. "What is going on?" The Valanthi looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Separatists," he gasped. "They have taken the throne room. They are going to kill the Queen." Then he pulled free and ran, leaving Jake alone in the corridor. Separatists. Jake had heard rumors about them during his time on the ship. A faction of Valanthi who hated their queen's policies, who believed she was weakening the empire by trying to build relationships with other species. They wanted to return to the old ways, when Valanthi stood apart from the galaxy and ruled their corner of space with an iron hand. Jake should have found a place to hide. This was not his fight. These were not his people. If the Queen died, it would be a tragedy for the Valanthi, but it would not change his life in any meaningful way. But Jake was not good at doing what he should do. He never had been. He ran toward the throne room. The doors were open when he arrived. 2 Volante guards lay dead on the floor, their blood forming silver pools on the crystal tiles. Inside, Jake could see movement, fighting, screams. He did not have a weapon. He looked around frantically and saw a metal tray that had fallen from a serving cart. It was heavy, solid. Not a weapon, but better than nothing. He picked it up and went inside. The throne room was large and beautiful, with high ceilings and walls covered in art that had taken centuries to create. Right now, it was filled with violence. At least a dozen armed separatists had overwhelmed the royal guard. Bodies lay everywhere. The queen was on her knees in the center of the room, surrounded by enemies, her face bloody but proud dot, and in the far corner, Jake saw Princess Alith. 3 separatists had cornered her. She was backed against the wall, her hands raised in a useless gesture of defense. One of the attackers raised his energy blade, its edge glowing white with heat. Jake did not think. He simply moved. He crossed the room faster than he had ever moved in his life. The first separatist did not even see him coming. Jake swung the metal tray with all his strength and caught the attacker in the side of the head. The Volante dropped like a stone. The other 2 turned, surprised. No one had expected the human to fight. No one had expected the human to be a threat. That was their mistake. Jake threw himself at the second separatist, driving his shoulder into the attacker's chest. They went down together, crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Jake felt the energy blade slice across his ribs, cutting through flesh and muscle. The pain was white-hot, blinding. He ignored it. He grabbed the separatist's head and slammed it against the floor. Once, twice, 3 times. The attacker stopped moving. The third separatist was on him before he could stand. The energy blade came down in a vicious arc, and Jake raised his arm to block it. The blade cut clean through his forearm, and he screamed. But he did not stop. He drove his knee into the attacker's stomach, then grabbed the Volante's throat with his good hand. They struggled, rolling across the blood-slicked floor. The separatist was stronger, taller, better trained. But Jake was human, and humans did not know how to quit. The blade pierced his shoulder. He felt it go in, felt it scrape against bone. The world went gray at the edges. He tightened his grip on the attacker's throat and squeezed, until something broke. The separatist went limp. Jake tried to stand but fell to his knees. Blood poured from his wounds, mixing with the silver blood of the Volante on the floor. The room was spinning. He could hear fighting still happening somewhere nearby, but it seemed very far away. Princess Alith was staring at him. Her gold eyes were wide with shock. She was not hurt. That was good. That was all that mattered. More guards burst into the room. The remaining separatists were overwhelmed, killed or captured in a matter of moments. Jake watched it happen through a haze of pain. He was still holding the metal tray, bent and covered in blood. His blood. Their blood. Everyone's blood. Someone was shouting orders. Someone else was calling for doctors. Jake tried to focus, but his body had other ideas. It had taken too much damage. It needed to shut down. He looked at the princess one more time. She was safe. He had done something right. Then he fell forward onto the cold crystal floor and let the darkness take him. He did not know how long he was unconscious. It could have been hours or days. He drifted in and out, aware of voices and lights and hands touching his wounds. Sometimes he heard the soft language of the Volante. Sometimes he heard machines beeping. Once he thought he heard the Queen's voice, cold and commanding. "Save him," she said. "I do not care what it takes. Save him." But that could have been a dream. Everything felt like a dream. When Jake finally opened his eyes, really opened them, he found himself in the medical bay. Clean white walls surrounded him. His body was wrapped in bandages. Everything hurt, but he was alive, and Queen Saralyn was sitting beside his bed, watching him with eyes that held something he had never seen before. He did not know it yet, but his life had just changed forever. The blood he had shed on the throne room floor had bought him something precious, something dangerous, something he had never wanted, Dot. It had bought him a place among the Volanti, and they were not going to let him leave. Jake stared at the Queen and said nothing. His mind was still foggy from the drugs they had given him for the pain. His body felt like it had been torn apart and put back together by someone who did not quite know how humans worked. Queen Saralyn sat perfectly still in her chair. She was dressed in white, as pure and clean as the walls around them. Her silver hair was arranged in perfect patterns. Her gold eyes watched him without blinking. "You have been unconscious for 3 days," she said. Her voice was soft but carried weight. Every word mattered. "Our doctors were not certain you would survive. Your injuries were severe. Any other species would have died on the throne room floor." Jake tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Someone had placed a glass of water beside his bed. He reached for it with a trembling hand and drank slowly. "Thank you for saving me," he finally said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rough and broken. The Queen tilted her head slightly. "You thank me for saving you, but you do not speak of what you did." Jake thought about the fight, the blood, the pain, the feeling of the energy blade cutting through his flesh. He did not want to think about it. "I did what needed to be done," he said. "Your daughter was in danger. I helped." For a long moment the Queen was silent. She seemed to be studying him, looking for something in his face that he could not name. Then she spoke again, and her words changed everything. "Among my people, there is a concept called the binding of blood. It is old, older than our empire, older than our written history. When one person sheds their blood freely to save another, without obligation, without hope of reward, they create a bond that cannot be broken." Jake frowned. He did not understand what she was saying. The Queen continued, "You are human. You owed nothing to my daughter. Our peoples are not allies. Our peoples are barely tolerant of each other. Yet, when you saw her in danger, you fought for her. You nearly died for her. You shed your blood on my throne room floor for a girl you did not know." "I saw someone who needed help," Jake said slowly. "I could not just stand there and watch her die. That is precisely my point." The Queen leaned forward slightly. "You did not help her because of duty or loyalty or politics. You helped her because it was the right thing to do. That is what makes the bond valid. That is what makes it unbreakable." Jake felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that by the oldest laws of my people, you have bound yourself to my house. And my house has bound itself to you." The Queen's voice was calm, almost gentle. "You cannot leave. Not as a prisoner, but as a member of my household. You will be given rank, title, and a place within the palace. You will serve as my daughter's sworn protector." For a moment, Jake was certain he had misheard. The drugs must have been affecting his brain. There was no way the Queen had just said what he thought she said. "I am sorry," he said carefully, "but I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding. I am just a soldier, a human soldier. I do not belong in your palace. I do not belong anywhere near your daughter." The Queen smiled. It was a strange expression on her face, like watching a statue come to life. "You think I would prefer someone else to guard my child? Someone who fought for pay or position or power?" She shook her head slowly. "Those people failed. When the separatists attacked, my guards fell. My advisors hid. My loyal servants abandoned their posts. But you, a stranger, a human, ran toward the danger. You picked up a metal tray and fought with your bare hands against armed enemies. You took wounds that should have killed you, and you did not stop until my daughter was safe. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but the queen raised her hand. I have ruled this empire for 40 years. I have seen courage and cowardice in every form. I know the difference between those who serve for profit and those who serve because they cannot do otherwise. Her gold eyes locked onto his. You are the second kind. That is why you must stay. The room was very quiet. Jake could hear the soft hum of machines monitoring his vital signs. He could hear his own heartbeat, steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. What if I refuse? He asked quietly. The queen's expression did not change. Then I will respect your choice. The binding of blood does not create slaves. You would be free to go. She paused. But I am asking you, not commanding you. My daughter is precious to me. She is the future of my people. I have seen what happens when those who guard her are motivated by lesser things. I do not want to see it again. Jake thought about the princess, her wide eyes in the throne room, her face as he fell. She was young, probably the Volante equivalent of her early 20s. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply been born into a family that made her a target. He thought about his own life. What was waiting for him in human space? A military discharge, maybe. A small pension. A quiet apartment on some forgotten colony world where he would spend his days remembering the people he could not save. Here, he could make a difference. Here, he could protect someone who needed protecting. But this was insane. He was human. These people did not trust humans. They did not even like humans. How could he possibly live among them? How could he possibly belong? Your nobles will not accept me, he said. Your people will not accept me. I will always be an outsider. Yes, the queen agreed. You will face challenges. You will face hatred and suspicion. But you have already proven that you do not back down from difficult situations. She stood up from her chair and looked down at him. I do not offer you an easy life, Jake Collins. I offer you a meaningful one. Jake lay there for a long time after she left. He stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that had happened. 3 days ago, he had been floating through space, waiting to die. Now he was being asked to become part of an alien royal household. It was madness. It was impossible. But when the queen returned the next morning and asked for his answer, Jake said yes. He did not know what the future would bring. He did not know if he was making the right choice. But he knew one thing for certain. He was tired of running away from things. He was tired of letting life happen to him. For once, he was going to run towards something, even if it terrified him. 6 months passed. Jake learned to live among the Volante, but he never learned to feel comfortable. The palace was beautiful beyond anything he had ever imagined. Towers of crystal reached toward the sky. Gardens filled with plants from 100 worlds surrounded pools of clear water. Music played softly in the halls, and servants moved silently through corridors that seemed to glow with inner light. And everywhere Jake went, he felt eyes on his back. The Volante nobility hated him. They did not hide it. They would stop talking when he entered a room. They would leave when he sat down to eat. They whispered about him in their soft language, knowing he could not understand the words, but could certainly understand the tone. He was called many things: barbarian, animal, the queen's pet. Some said he had tricked the queen somehow, used human deception to worm his way into the palace. Others said he was dangerous, that one day he would show his true nature and hurt someone. A few even suggested that he should be killed quietly before he could cause trouble. Jake heard all of it. He pretended he did not. His job was simple. He was the princess's guardian. Where she went, he followed. When she attended functions, he stood behind her chair. When she walked through the gardens, he watched the shadows for threats. He was her shield, always present, always alert. At first, Princess Alice seemed uncomfortable with his presence. She would glance at him with uncertainty, as if she did not know how to behave around him. He was not a servant she could order. He was not a noble she could charm. He was something else entirely, something that did not fit into the neat categories of her world. But slowly, over weeks and months, things began to change. It started with small moments. Jake noticed that Alice liked to read in a particular corner of the library, where the light came through colored glass and painted rainbows on the floor. He began standing near the window instead of by the door, so she could have privacy while still being protected. She noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. Then came the questions. At first, they were polite and distant. What was Earth like? How did humans live? What did they eat? Jake answered simply, without elaboration. But Alice was curious, and her questions grew more personal over time. What was his family like? Did he have brothers and sisters? What had made him become a soldier? Jake found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about growing up on a colony world at the edge of human space. He told her about his mother, who had worked in the agricultural domes, and his father, who had died in a mining accident when Jake was 12. He told her about joining the military because he did not know what else to do with his life. In return, Alice told him about herself. She spoke of the pressure of being the only heir to a vast empire. She spoke of the loneliness of growing up surrounded by people who only saw her title. She spoke of her dreams, simple dreams, to see the galaxy without guards and protocols, to meet people who did not bow when she entered a room. Jake taught her to play cards. Human card games, simple ones at first, then more complex ones. They would sit in her chambers during the quiet hours of the evening, dealing hands and talking about nothing important. For a few hours, she could pretend she was not a princess. He could pretend he belonged somewhere. The nobility grew more hostile as months passed. They saw the friendship forming between the human and the princess, and they did not like it. One night, a young noble named Varric approached Jake in the corridor outside the dining hall. "You do not belong here," Varric said. His voice was cold with contempt. "You are not one of us. You will never be one of us. The queen may have lost her mind, but we have not." Jake said nothing. He had learned that silence often worked better than words. But Varric was not finished. "I challenge you to a duel of honor. If you have any courage at all, you will accept." Jake knew what this was. Valanthi honor duels were formal affairs, fought with energy blades under strict rules. Varric was young, strong, and had trained with weapons since childhood. He expected Jake to refuse or to be easily defeated. Jake accepted. The duel took place the next morning in the palace courtyard. Dozens of nobles gathered to watch. Most of them expected to see the human humiliated or killed. A few looked worried, as if they suspected something the others did not. Queen Saralyn watched from a balcony above. Her face showed nothing. Varric was fast. His blade moved like water, cutting through the air with precision and grace. He had been trained by the best teachers in the Empire. He had won a dozen duels before this one, but Jake was human. And Valanthi did not truly understand what that meant. Humans had evolved on a world that wanted to kill them. They had survived ice ages and famines and predators that were faster and stronger than they were. They had learned to endure pain that would stop other species. They had learned to keep fighting when their bodies told them to stop. Varric cut Jake twice in the first minute. The wounds burned and blood flowed down Jake's arms. But he did not fall. He did not slow down. He watched Varric's patterns, learned his movements, and waited. When the opening came, Jake took it. He moved inside Varric's guard and struck with a blow that was not elegant, but was very, very effective. Varric went down hard, his blade flying from his hand. Jake stood over him, breathing heavily, bleeding from half a dozen cuts. "Do you yield?" he asked quietly. Varric stared up at him with something new in his golden eyes. Not hatred. Something closer to fear. "I yield," he whispered. Jake turned and walked away. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the Queen. He went to the medical bay and let the doctors treat his wounds. That night, Princess Aleph came to see him. She sat beside his bed, just as her mother had done months ago, and looked at him with those curious gold eyes. "Why did you fight him?" she asked. "You could have refused. No one would have blamed you." Jake thought about the question for a long moment. "Because if I had refused, they would have thought they could push me around forever. Sometimes you have to show people what you are made of." Aleph was quiet for a while. Then she asked another question, one that surprised him. "What are humans made of, Jake?" He smiled, even though it hurt his cut lip. "Stubbornness, mostly, and a complete inability to know when to quit." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her really laugh, without restraint, without dignity. It was a good sound. Things were not perfect after that. The nobles still disliked him. He still felt like an outsider. But something had shifted. He had found a place. Maybe not a home, not yet, but something close enough. The diplomatic summit was the biggest event in a generation. Leaders from 12 different species had gathered on a neutral station to discuss trade, borders, and the future of their corner of the galaxy. Queen Saralyn was there to represent the Valanthi Empire. Princess Aleph accompanied her as part of her training. And Jake followed them both, watching every shadow, studying every face. He did not like this place. Too many people. Too many corners where enemies could hide. Too many ways for things to go wrong. The summit was held in a massive assembly hall at the center of the station. The ceiling rose 50 feet above the floor, decorated with symbols from every participating species. Long tables stretched across the room, filled with delegates and advisors and guards. Jake stood behind Princess Aleph, as he always did. He watched the crowd. He watched the doors. He watched the servants moving between tables, carrying food and drinks. Something felt wrong. He could not explain it. The air was too still. The servants moved too quickly. Small things, details that most people would never notice. He leaned down and whispered to Aleph, "Stay close to me. Something is not right." She looked at him with concern but did not argue. She had learned to trust his instincts. The explosion came without warning. The blast tore through the center of the hall, throwing bodies and debris in every direction. The noise was deafening. Fire erupted from broken fuel lines in the walls. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Jake grabbed Aleph and pulled her to the floor, covering her body with his own. Glass and metal rained down around them. People were screaming. Someone was shouting orders in a language he did not recognize. When the debris stopped falling, Jake lifted his head and looked around. The hall was chaos. Delegates were running for the exits. Guards were trying to restore order. And in the middle of it all, he saw the Queen. Saralyn was trapped beneath a fallen support beam. She was alive, conscious, struggling to free herself. But the beam was too heavy, and she could not move it alone. Blood covered the side of her face, silver in the emergency lighting, and separatists were moving toward her through the smoke. Jake made a decision in half a heartbeat. He turned to Aleph and gripped her shoulders. "Run to the exit. Find guards. Do not stop for anything." "But my mother, I will get her. Go, now." Aleph hesitated for only a moment. Then she ran, disappearing into the smoke and confusion. Jake turned and sprinted toward the Queen. The separatists saw him coming. There were 5 of them, armed with energy blades and hate in their eyes. They had planned this attack carefully. They had waited for the perfect moment. And they were not going to let one human stop them. Jake hit the first one at full speed, driving his shoulder into the attacker's chest. They went down together, rolling across the debris-covered floor. Jake grabbed a piece of broken metal and drove it into the Separatist's throat before the enemy could recover. The other four surrounded him. Jake stood slowly, the metal shard still in his hand. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. His ears were ringing from the explosion. His body ached from the impact. He did not care. He had to reach the Queen. The fight was brutal and ugly. Jake had no finesse, no grace. He fought like what he was, a desperate man with nothing to lose. He took cuts and blows that would have stopped anyone else. He kept moving, kept swinging, kept refusing to fall. When the last Separatist dropped, Jake was barely standing. His left arm hung useless at his side, the shoulder dislocated. Blood poured from wounds he could not count. But he was alive, and the Queen was still trapped. He reached her and knelt beside the beam. It was heavy, heavier than anything he should be able to lift. But he did not think about that. He just grabbed it and pulled. His muscles screamed. His wounds tore open wider. He felt something in his back give way, a sharp snap of pain that nearly dropped him. But he did not stop. The beam shifted, moved, rose. Queen Saralyn crawled. Free. Jake let the beam fall and collapsed beside it. He could not feel his legs. He could not see clearly. The world was fading to gray around the edges. The Queen grabbed his face in her hands and forced him to look at her. "Stay with me," she commanded. "Do not you dare die." "That is an order." Jake tried to smile. "Yes, Your Majesty," he whispered. Then everything went dark. He woke in a hospital bed. Again. He was getting tired of waking in hospital beds. Princess Aleph was beside him. Her eyes were red from crying. When she saw him open his eyes, she grabbed his hand and squeezed so hard it hurt. "You fool," she said. "You absolute fool." Jake coughed weakly. "Is your mother safe?" Aleph nodded. "She is fine. Because of you. Everyone is talking about what you did. The human who carried the Queen out of fire. The human who fought 5 Separatists with a piece of broken metal." Jake closed his eyes. "I was just doing my job." "No." Aleth's voice was firm. "You were doing much more than that." The Queen visited him that evening. She walked into the room with a dignity that seemed impossible for someone who had nearly died hours before. She stood at the foot of his bed and looked at him for a long time. "I am going to do something unprecedented," she finally said. "Something that will shock my people and anger many of them. But I do not care." Jake waited. "I am naming you a lord of the Volanthi Empire. You will be the first human ever granted noble standing among my people. You will have land, titles, and the full protection of my house." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but the Queen raised her hand. "You have bled for my daughter. You have bled for me. You have asked for nothing and given everything. If this is what humanity is, then perhaps the galaxy has misjudged your species." She paused. "Perhaps I have misjudged your species." She extended her hand, not to shake, but to clasp, wrist to wrist, in the traditional Volanthi gesture of respect between equals. Jake reached up with his good arm and took her wrist. Aleph moved to stand beside her mother. She was smiling through her tears. She placed her hand over theirs, completing the bond. Jake looked at them both. The Queen and the Princess, these alien women who had somehow become his family. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. The drifting escape pod. The throne room fight. The months of being an outsider. He had never planned any of this. He had never wanted to be a hero. He had just done what needed to be done. But sometimes, that was enough. Sometimes, being human was enough. He closed his eyes and let himself rest. For the first time in a very long time, he did not feel like a stranger. He was home.